Hello, my name is Agnieszka Pikulicka-Wilczewska and this is Turan Tales, a podcast about Central Asia. It delves into stories of people, politics, social change and more, and is part of my newsletter which you can support on Substack. Welcome and be my guest in the journey to Central Asia. Hi listeners! As many of you have already noticed, last week we published our first immersive audio documentary, made possible by the International Press Institute and titled The Capital, In Search of Astana's Soul. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it and whether you enjoyed this new format. If you did, I'd like to take a moment to ask you to consider supporting us with a paid subscription. I don't want to introduce paywalls or force anyone to pay, but it goes without saying that the work we do is not free. I always strive to maintain the highest standards of sound and journalism, and to that end, I work with a text editor and 2 sound editors. One of them is Eva Dunar, the co-creator of last week's audio documentary and a talented podcast producer. I would love for us to continue working beyond the first few audio documentaries. You can help us make that happen by upgrading to a paid subscription at turantales.substack.com/subscribe. I've also set up a Buy Me a Coffee account where you can choose one of 4 membership tiers or make a one-off donation. Any support means a lot. As for today's episode, we'll be talking about Uyat and Central Asia's culture of shame. Joining us is Dr. Hélène Thibault, Associate Professor of Political Science at Nazarbayev University in Astana. Her research focuses on religious and gender identities in Central Asia, and she has published extensively on topics such as religious revival, sex work, and polygamy in the region. 2 years ago, she co-edited a book titled Uyat and the Culture of Shame in Central Asia, which brings together fascinating analyses by some of the most interesting local and foreign scholars. Before we start, a small disclaimer. Yes, I do realize that Hélène and I are 2 Western women discussing an issue that primarily affects local communities and, at times, has a deeply destructive impact on their lives. I'm talking about the culture of shame. So, to fully understand what Uyat is, it would of course be important to speak with local scholars and everyday people. Still, I hope that we've managed to provide a thoughtful introduction to the subject. Welcome to Turan Talks. Hi, Hélène. Thank you so much for accepting my invitation.
Hi, thank you for reaching out. I'm happy to have this discussion with you.
Let's start from the very beginning. What is Uyat? And what role does it play in Central Asian societies?
So Uyat is a word that is used in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan that refers to a set of norms and repressive practices that are meant to invite or pressure people into behaving in a certain way. A behavior that is considered moral and ethical in the society. In other Central Asian countries, there are different names used, but Uyat, a good translation would be shame. So shame is often the translation that we use in English for that. Let's say a more academic definition would be a set of repressive practices that are meant to impose a specific behavior.
And what role does it play? We all know, everyone who's been to Central Asia knows that people here can be very nosy. People here also have very strict definitions of how to live a good life, right? So what role does it play in everyday life?
Coming back to your first question, so I'm a slow thinker. One thing that is important to acknowledge is that Uyat, for instance, and what we call the culture of shame is definitely not inherent to Central Asian societies, right? So this is something that exists in many societies that tends to have lost its significance in many societies that are more individualistic. But Central Asian societies continue to be very focused on the community, and extended social bonds outside the family are very strong. Bonds to the community, bonds to the neighborhood, the larger family, and within the nuclear family, of course, as well. So it's a form of social regulation that is almost typical in different societies, but it's still quite prevalent here today because of this form of very strong social bonds that we see. So societies, I think you will agree that Central Asian societies are not very individualistic. So in individualistic societies, shame is not a social mechanism that is efficient because people are individualistic and they actually don't really care what other people do and don't care what other people think of them. That's why I don't want to give the listeners the impression that is something very typical of Central Asian societies. You find this in societies that are considered a bit more traditional. So yeah, but in Central Asian societies, as you mentioned, people are very interested in other people's lives. Sometimes complete strangers will ask you, right, very personal questions, which as a foreigner, I find quite surprising at times, yes.
So tell me your craziest experience of Uyat, or something that maybe struck you or surprised you in Central Asia.
Typically, strangers will ask you either in some form of superficial interactions that you have with them. Would that be at the bank or, I don't know, taxi drivers are very good at making conversations with the...
Yes.
This should be an entire topic in itself, like conversations with the taxisti. One example would be, the fact that I'm in my 40s and I'm not married and I don't have children. So I'm not very confirming the gender expectations of the society that I live in. So this is something that I'm constantly reminded of. And if I say I don't have children, and then their answer is, "Oh, there is still time." So it's not necessarily shaming, but I can feel that it's something that I should fix, that is not really acceptable, and there's something should be done about it. The same was with absence of marriage when I worked in Tajikistan. The fact that I was not married was terrible for people around me. And they constantly tried to get me married, so I would fulfill the expectations of a woman my age. There's another story I remembered from Almaty a few years ago. I was in a beauty salon having my nails done. There was also a hairdresser on the spot, and she asked me if I wanted to dye my hair to cover my gray hair, and I said no. And then as I was paying, they were asking me all sorts of questions, and again asking me if I wanted to dye my hair, and I said, no, I don't think I need to. I don't actually have a lot of gray hair. And then they were asking me if I was married, and I said no. And they said, do you have a fiancé at least? And I said no. And then her response was, well, that's why you should dye your hair. That's why you don't have a fiancé. I was really startled by this. And then I said, well, I don't think that's the problem. And I think my appearance is fine. I'm okay with it. And then she said, well, that's what you think. Вам так кажется. And I couldn't believe it. That was so rude. Basically, she was telling me that the reason why I didn't have a husband or a fiance was that I was not good looking enough. That was so offensive. And I laughed it off because I'm a grown woman, and these kind of things don't have a big impact on me, especially from people I don't know. But I kept thinking, if that's the kind of things that young women are told from an early young age, it's kind of hard to build self-confidence. So that was a bit rough.
I have exactly the same experiences because I'm also an unmarried woman in Central Asia, not yet 40, but almost. So I'm also not conforming to the rules and expectations of people, obviously. So I know it very well. And yes, and in taxis, this happens very often. So how does Uyat really manifest itself? So is Uyat this comment that you receive from a taxi driver or someone else, or maybe your neighbor, or is Uyat something different? How do we grasp this concept?
Traditionally, in smaller communities, it would be, I would say, gossip. Yeah, would be would be the mechanism. Yeah, to enforce shame, to make somebody feel shameful for their behavior. So what is interesting is that one of the authors from my book, Maria Levitanis, she's saying that Uyat functions in a way that it's not about transgressing a norm. So it's not the transgressive behavior that is specifically problematic, it's public perception. So if you are doing something that is considered immoral or not conform to the expectations of society and nobody knows about it, then people will not feel shame. Shame is imposed by others. It's a relational, kind of mechanism. Some people also compare it to, we don't use that approach in the book, but we could have used a Foucauldian, panopticon theoretical lens to make sense of Uyat, because it's about people's relations to each other. This is how it is enforced. So it's more about the public perception and how people see you and what people will talk about, what people will say about you. And especially, I think here family bonds are very strong, and it's most of the time the parents which will not necessarily shame others, but they will try also enforce this behavior upon their children because they don't want to feel shame. They don't want to feel shame because of their children who are transgressing some social norms, typically associated in this day and age, associated with sexual conduct, especially. So this is something we can talk about too, but I would say, at least in the context of Kazakhstan, women are a lot more subjected to this public scrutiny than men are, although it also has some effects on men. But so it's an enforcing mechanism, I would say, related to other people's opinions. So that you don't want to bring attention to yourself for the wrong reasons.
We will get to concrete examples and its gender aspect as well in a second. But do we know, is there any research about the practice of shaming and where it comes from? Do we know its roots in Central Asia, or it's just something that evolves in every single traditional society?
Well, I think it's typical of most traditional societies, again, that are very closely knit. Like societies in Central Asia are, and that tends to change over time. So it's not something that is fixed in time. It has evolved over time for sure, and especially in Kazakhstan has seen a very rapid urbanization in the last 2 decades. So this is really, it's something that is changing. So it's not something, again, that is typical only of Central Asian societies, but it's still prevalent because of the communitarian character of societies in Central Asia. But it's changing because of urbanization, because of modernization, or some would say post-modernization. So that, and one chapter in the book actually tackles that. The chapter written by Muldir Kabilova. So she's actually talking about the fact that Kazakhstani society is de-traditionalizing. So contrary to what a lot of scholars have written about. So she's saying that Uyat is losing its significance here in Central Asia in some contexts. So again, it has its own specialities. In which spaces is this enforced, and in which time is it enforced? So it is evolving like any other social practices.
So can you give us maybe some concrete examples about how it's evolving? Because I can imagine that in the Kazakh context, people who move to big cities and the society becomes more atomized, right? We live more anonymously. This is the context in which people can't really have expectations of others and also don't really know each other, so that they can expect, that the neighbors can expect something concrete from them. Is this the context that you mentioned, or are there any other contexts that we can talk about?
I think the idea that we have this very rapid, strong urbanization is really changing, I think, social norms and expectations, indeed. And that would be something interesting to look at, because in Astana, in the capital of Kazakhstan, where I live, the capital receives, I think, around 50,000 new inhabitants every year. So it's really growing fast. if not more. Yeah, I'm actually thinking about that. I think it's around 80,000 more inhabitants every year. So it's really changing social dynamics, because indeed people don't know each other. They live in new neighborhoods. Yeah, their parents are far away, their relatives are far away. So I think these kind of dynamics are meant to become less relevant in the future. They are already. So Maldet Kabilova, she's mentioning this in her chapter. She ran a survey among people, asking if Uyat is an important part of Kazakh culture and should it be a guide in decision making. And a majority of respondents from across Kazakhstan, a majority said no. This is not a tradition that is worth keeping, actually. So that was really interesting. But what is changing also is that, like everywhere else in the world, people in Kazakhstan, or maybe actually even more than elsewhere, Kazakhstanis spend a lot of time online. and some of this manifestation of Uyat has transposed itself online. So there is a lot of debates and shaming online for photos posted, for behavior that is deemed like a bit too wild, too liberal, especially for women. So this is something we can talk about, but yeah, so Uyat has become also digital. So it's also evolving in that way.
This is something that I actually wanted to talk about because, well, the context that I know better is Uzbekistan, where I spent 3 years. And I think that Uyat is still a very, very pertinent and present regulation mechanism in society. So comments online, this is one of those spaces where Uyat actually plays a very big role. And I remember for a time, I mean, when TikTok was becoming very popular among teenagers, in Uzbekistan, even on Uzbek TV, there was this discussion about how using TikTok by girls can affect their chances of getting married in the future. So basically, there was a big discussion where people who were supposedly experts were talking about TikTok and saying that publishing, different dances or whatever, like dance moves by girls, can actually affect their chances of getting married in the future. This was a serious discussion. So I guess in a digital age, Uyat also enters new spaces. So in what context do you see this in Kazakhstan, for example, this online Uyat?
Yeah, so there were a lot of cases that we discussed in the book. We presented the book of this form of online shaming, mostly directed towards women. Again, Kazakhstanis spend a lot of time on Instagram, and people post a lot. They read a lot. So whenever an influencer behaves in a way that seems like too liberal, too liberated, sexually liberated, perhaps this person appears to be sexually active, even though they will not talk about the intimate details. They will not share the intimate details of their sexual life, but they are perceived as promiscuous, let's say, presenting themselves as in very sexy outfits, and there will always be groups of men who will attack them viciously sometimes. So this is activists, also feminist activists, also attacked online by some powerful lobby groups in Kazakhstan. For instance, there's the Association of Parents of Kazakhstan, which you probably know. They're quite vocal, quite active, and they themselves use Instagram a lot, and then they will repost publications made by people and say, "Oh, look at this! What a shame! This is so unacceptable. This person has no respect for our culture." The thing that infuriates, I think, the most is when this kind of promiscuous behavior is associated with traditional elements. So one of the cases we talk about in the book is this influencer who posted a photo of herself with traditional Kazakh jewelry, wearing that, but wearing very little clothes. And this was the ultimate offense for some people, because especially Uyat is so strongly associated with the respect for national traditions. So this was a double transgression, right? So wearing traditional elements while presenting yourself in a way that is, in a very sexy pose or sexy outfit. So this was quite interesting. So what it does is that they are influencers themselves, mostly men, but not always, who will repost that and then shame those women who are transgressing those social norms. There was another case in Astana of a statue representing characters of a folktale. People call it like Kazakh Romeo and Juliet. And
on Nurjol Boulevard.
Yes. And so the statue, indeed, it is a bit strange to me because the woman who is represented, she does have very obvious curves. But this is a bronze statue, right? That is meant to be, I don't know, part of the public architecture. But so-called self-designated Uyat man took a scarf and then covered the statue. So this was back in 2018, maybe. I can't remember the date exactly. Covered the statue and said, I have given the statue back its dignity by covering her body. Because she's not naked, she's dressed. I mean, the representation of the statue is dressed, but yeah, so this created a big scandal. This man was also a bit ridiculed online because it was, it seemed as a bit of an absurd move from his side to protect the dignity of a statue. I mean, this one is a bit funny, but when it concerns like specific individuals, women can really face severe backlash in threats and violent threats. So it can be quite nasty.
Yeah, like policing women's bodies in Central Asia is basically a national sport, I would say. But I have this example of my friend in Uzbekistan. She got divorced. It wasn't really her decision. It was mostly her husband's. But she was a 30-something, beautiful young woman, very successful, educated abroad. Her family was also educated. They knew that it wasn't her fault that she got divorced. And yet, her mother insisted that she comes back to the family home and lives together with her so that people don't gossip that she might be promiscuous, that she as a divorcee might get involved in some extramarital affairs maybe, or she might be behaving not in a way that is accepted in the culture. And she agreed. She did come back to live with her mother. So this example, this story actually showed me that Uyat still has a very big impact on not only on people's lives, but that people actually agree to be governed by the requirements of Uyat in many cases. So from your experience and your research, do people still let Uyat and social norms regulate their lives? Or is it much less common?
Again, I would say it depends on the setting, urban or rural. In rural areas, it's a lot harder to escape people's judgment. In urban settings, it's a lot easier. And well, yeah, that's an interesting question, right? So why do people go along with it? And I think, like you mentioned, in this specific case, and as I mentioned before too, so it's often to please the parents, right? So that parents would not experience the shame because of your own behavior. Yeah, even though your behavior is perfectly fine, maybe even for them it's fine, but they know that the community will not accept it, so then they play along with it. So that's the case in that Levitanus in our book. Her chapter focuses on the shame experienced by members of the LGBTQ community in Kazakhstan. So it's probably even worse in Uzbekistan, where male homosexuality continues to be criminalized. So yes, it's not the case here, but there's strong social taboo against homosexuality. So that's another powerful example of how Uyat is regulating the display of the sexual identity of people, sexual orientation of people. And Levitanus, she talks about this internalized shame that homosexuals experience in Kazakhstan, and that they are constantly reminded that they are not conforming to the expectations of society, and that they themselves feel ashamed or always fear to be shamed, publicly shamed for who they are. And that's even worse because it's not something that you have no control over, like divorce, let's say, or it's not a punctual action that you will make. I mean, some I don't know, some kind of small crime or something. You beat up somebody, I don't know what, or you have an extramarital affair, but that's one point in time. But if it's your sexual orientation, it's very dramatic because there's nothing you can do about it. Yeah, I think there's this idea of wanted to protect your family. I think that's probably some of the most important, the most powerful motivation for playing along with those social norms. However, I want to mention that one of my students last year wrote his MA thesis on how unmarried women in their 30s in Kazakhstan experience public pressure to get married, right? So, and it was very interesting because Jeffrey van der Beek is his name. He's from the Netherlands. So he conducted more than 20 interviews, and there were actually a lot of respondents who were saying, yes, I know, like my family, they are pressuring me. They remind me all the time. They remind my parents that I'm not married and I should do something about it because it's not normal. But many of them were indifferent. They were saying, oh, well, they can say what they want, you know. I'm not going to get married just for the sake of getting married. It's not that they were against getting married, but they couldn't find a partner that was suitable for them. So that was interesting. But these were educated, multilingual women in their 30s who had good jobs, who could support themselves. One thing I want to add as well, why people play along with it, in Kazakhstan, again, it's not so much the case, but in the book, we have also a chapter written by Zhibek Kenjembaeva and Elena Kim. And they write about the concept of nebere alo, which refers to giving your newborn, your firstborn, to the grandparents, the parents of the father, of the groom, let's say. So there's a young couple, they have a baby, but the baby will be raised by the parents of the young father. This is to some extent also in Kazakhstan, but it's stronger in Kyrgyzstan, but it's also connected not only to social norms, but to the absence of, almost complete absence of social security and social security services. So this is something that we have to take into consideration, is that in countries that are, well, community is very important. You need those people to survive. You need your surroundings to survive, because there's a lot of solidarity between communities, yeah, between neighbors, between neighborhoods. I'm always surprised, like in Central Asia, there are so few homeless people.
Yes.
So few. And I come from Canada, and there are so many homeless people in Canada. Whereas Canada is a country where, I mean, with a very high standards of living. So Uyat, this is something I want to mention. Of course, it can be oppressive, but it can also serve as protection, because it also encourages good behavior. Yeah, like taking care of elder people and taking care of sick people. So you don't leave them behind. Yeah, no one's left behind. So that's also quite interesting. And in the context of Kyrgyzstan, giving your newborn to your parents will ensure that they have some support. I mean, when the child is growing older, so they will always have somebody to take care of them. There's this economic aspect I think behind this that sustains the imposition of those mechanisms.
When it comes to this practice, it's also called Bauri Nasalo, and very good Kazakh movie Bauri Nasalo about the practice of giving the firstborn, usually male, child to the parents. And I also wrote about this on Turan Tales. So if any of our listeners now wants to go back and read a little bit more about this practice, then please feel free to look at it. And coming back to Uyat, I remember one conversation I had with a religious leader in Uzbekistan about the LGBT people. And I asked him, why do you care? Like, this is none of your business, you know? It's none of your business what somebody does behind closed doors. As long as they don't harm you, as long as they don't do anything against you, why would you care? And he got very quite defensive, obviously. But his reasoning was also that it doesn't really matter. Because if children, for example, from this community will know that a couple that is, you know, same-sex couple lives in our building or in our mahalla, and that they see that this is happening, it will get normalized. Once this kind of behavior gets normalized, it can corrupt other people. It can corrupt children. So even the existence of a person whose behavior is supposedly transgressive in the eyes of this given community can be a danger in itself. So that's why every single reflection or every single manifestation of transgression has to be removed from the community. And to me, like, this was really scary, you know, because it means that we all have to comply, especially, you know, in a conservative Central Asian context.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, like, do you have any experience with LGBT people communities in Central Asia and how they are responding to the culture of shame?
Yeah, so there's actually one chapter of the book dealing with that. So how people react to it and how they try to resist it. But it's not easy. I would say it's probably easier in Kazakhstan than anywhere else in Central Asia. But yeah, there's a lot of backlash online, and probably you are quite well aware of the existence of this organization called Feminita. They are based in Almaty. The leaders of the organization, they are openly advocating for LGBTQ communities, LGBTQ rights. They recently held they call it lesbian kurultay, which is some kind of council. It's a Kazakh word that refers to like some kind of important meeting to discuss social economic matters. Yeah, so they call it lesbian kurultay. So
that's also very transgressive,
yes,
very transgressive name.
It is, yes. And they get a lot of backlash, right? I find them very brave to do that, but they are sometimes physically assaulted by, not necessarily like blows, but they are denied entry in some places. People crashed their events. So some groups, either angry groups of men or conservative organizations. So for LGBTQ communities, it's really not easy to sustain that. And a lot of things are hidden, right, in Kazakhstan. So regarding the lives of LGBTQ people, so hiding is probably the best strategies, and it's heartbreaking because again, this chapter from Maria Levitanus, she cites a study that she didn't conduct herself, but somebody ran a survey among LGBTQ people. There were 204 participants, and 55% of them reported having suicidal tendencies or having even attempted to commit suicide. So it was 55% of them. So it's very large.
That's a lot. That's a lot.
So it's heartbreaking in that sense. Yeah.
And how does Uyat influence the lives of men? Because we've been talking about women, we've been talking about vulnerable communities, so LGBT people. But what about men? Because there are also quite a lot of social expectations towards men in Central Asian countries.
Yes, definitely. So I think the most visible targets of this form of social shaming are women. But men can be shamed too. I mean, most obvious is, homosexual men, but we have already talked about it. But it's also, traditionally, it's the men's perceived ability to control their family, especially women in their family. So if a man is perceived by the rest of the community as being weak, there might be shame brought upon him, because of that. And they are very interesting. An article that was published also by Yelena Kim a couple of years ago, when they mentioned that in the context of Kyrgyzstan, bride kidnapping, which is unfortunately not anecdotal there, so it's happening quite frequently. There are cases every few weeks. So bride kidnapping when a woman is taken from the street, basically, literally, and brought to a family, and she's forced to marry somebody she doesn't even know, probably. And because of shame that she could bring back to her family, she will not leave this place, even though she's unlikely to have a happy life there, forcibly married, and in some cases raped by this person on the first day. So that's the reason why she cannot go back to her family. So these are very tragic cases. Also, quite a few movies made in Kyrgyzstan on this issue. Mm-hmm. But Kim and her co-author, they say that bride kidnapping is not only an extreme manifestation of patriarchy, it's more than that. It's the idea that men, in the absence of economic success, loss of self-esteem, because Kyrgyzstan is quite poor, and since they don't have a lot, to be proud of, sometimes one of their incentives to kidnap a woman is to find a wife, because otherwise, if you're poor in Kyrgyzstan, marriages are expensive. So this is also one way to bypass, the cost of organizing a wedding. And if you're poor, you're not a very good candidate, because that's another thing that men should do, is that they need to provide for their families, So one of the expectations is that they need a good job, they need to buy a car, they need to provide their family with an apartment or a car or a house. And if they don't have that, then they cannot get married because they are not seen as attractive candidates, from a financial and social point of view. So bride kidnapping might be fueled by willingness to conform to social expectations for men to be successful, to have a family. So that's quite interesting. So men can also be pressured into succeeding in different ways of their lives, financially or socially.
Yeah, also like an important thing is that in Kyrgyzstan, traditionally, a man should offer a dowry to the woman's parents. So he has to pay for the woman, so he has to be able to afford a wife. Again, we also did a story about that. So we also have a long read and an audio story on Turan Tales about bride kidnapping. So if any of the listeners wants to go back to it, I really encourage you to do so, especially because the protagonist that we spoke to is actually a very, very brave woman. And now coming back to Uyat, in your book, you also published a chapter about shame in politics and culture of shame in Kazakhstani politics. Can you maybe explain how does it play out in the Central Asian context?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I got the idea of discussing the role of Uyat in politics after I saw Nursultan Nazarbayev was still president at the time, and I was watching the news, and he was sitting with his council of ministers, and he was scolding the ministers and telling them in front of live TV, right, that they were not good enough, they were doing that. And it was interesting to me, whereas in Kazakhstan, everyone is extremely polite, and there's a distinction between ty and vy in Russian, right? So between, polite you and ordinary you. And everyone talks to each other using vy unless you're close. And Nazarbayev was using ty to talk to the ministers, which was like children. So it was very interesting to me. And he was basically shaming them on live on TV. So I got interested in that. And then I realized that, and this is something I should have mentioned earlier when you asked me about, what is the historical evolution of Uyat? Where does it come from? So yeah, it's in constant evolution, but it reminded me that in the Soviet Union, it was also, a mechanism of social control, shaming people if they were lazy, they were not working enough, So there was a form of public shaming that was part of the imposition of socialist norms. So it's not something that we can connect specifically to traditional societies, because the Soviet society was not traditional; it was revolutionary. So that's interesting to see those mechanisms. So I was interested in looking at how does shame work in the political system. So some of the conclusions I made were that when individuals are shamed publicly, it's to keep people in check, but they tend to keep their jobs, actually. They keep their position, even though they are guilty of something, right? So guilty of underperforming as a minister, for instance. So they will be shamed, but they will not be sacked. Whereas there were cases of shaming among lower level administrators, like hakims, for instance, mayors or governors, of different provinces of Kazakhstan. So that was interesting. So when that happened, the shaming was kind of anonymous, So it could be connected to chorny PR, So blackmailing a bit, I mean, it's not blackmailing; it's like bad publicity, So these people were shamed during the pandemic. There was the case of one hakim, one mayor, during the pandemic. So there was like strong rules imposed in Kazakhstan to prevent social gatherings, and he and his buddies went to the sauna, to banya, and then they were caught with prostitutes as well in the banya.
No.
So this was really shameful, right?
Yes.
So
very.
double transgression of sanitary norms and social norms. But those people who are at lower levels of government, they tend to be sacked when they are. When this happens. So that was interesting. So there was a distinction to be made between high-level officials and lower-level officials.
And what happens in situations when the person who is being shamed stops caring or doesn't care and continues doing what they had been doing? Like, have you experienced maybe these kind of situations in which the person shaming has, been surprised with a reaction that they didn't expect? What happens in such situations?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think I have a specific example in mind, or perhaps the thesis that was written by my student. I would say because the girls in the study, they didn't get married. I must mention that their parents were not the ones putting pressure on them. It was mostly relatives, like aunts specifically. Like it was mostly women doing imposing the pressure on them. But so at times these girls they were saying, I avoid social gatherings. Like they can do whatever they want and say whatever they want about me. Like I'm just not gonna engage with them. But that's probably, I mean, it's not an ideal solution because you're breaking ties with your family, with your relatives. But I don't know if then relatives, would say, oh, well, it's not working, we should stop. I'm actually not sure. I mean, in my case, I would say, because again, not being married, one strategy I should have mentioned also is that I use here to avoid shaming is that I lie all the time. about my marital status. I say that I have a husband and 2 children, but that was interesting because it's never enough, right? It's like it's never enough. In my fake story, my children were 10 and 12. And then, of course, one taxi driver thought I had given birth too late because I was already in my 40s. So it was interesting. Actually, they were 8 and 10. And then I started changing my story to make it more credible. And then, so my children are now older. My imaginary children are now older to match my age.
Yeah, it's you can never be good enough, right?
Yeah,
I mean, even with your lies, the lies are not good enough. What I started doing, which I don't think it's very polite, but it definitely ends the conversation if someone is too invasive, is I just say that I haven't asked for your opinion. And I know that it can be considered very rude, but with some people, I think that this is the only way to kind of stop them from crossing another boundary that is basically hurting us.
And how do they react if you say that?
They are usually very surprised, taken aback, and they usually try to explain themselves like, oh no, don't get me wrong, I wasn't trying to be rude, but it usually works quite well. So
yeah.
But anyway, thank you so much, Hélène. This was a very interesting conversation. Yeah, and I encourage everyone to read Helene's book about Uyat and about the culture of shame in Central Asia.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad I could talk about our book. So it's an edited volume, I must mention. So I'm the editor together with Jean-François Caron, but there are 4 other contributors: Maria Levitinis, Karli Gashkabatova, Moldzir Kabilova, Zhibek Kenjabayeva, and together with Elena Kim. So they are quite interesting, a list of authors. And unfortunately, we cover only Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and this is one of my regrets, to not have included Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. So maybe in a future book.
That's it for today. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe to Turan Tales on Substack. I look forward to meeting you there and on my newsletter's social media.